with almost 50,000 produced between 1942 and 1945. The Sherman tank proved to be one of the most important tanks of World War II. Despite seeing service with all Allied armies and in all theatres, it's been constantly derided as undergunned, under-armoured and generally pretty inferior to the German armour it was being sent to face.
But how accurate is this assessment? Now, this is a huge subject. It's been debated for years. So what we're going to try and do in this video is to give you an idea of the strengths and the weaknesses and also the modifications the Sherman underwent during its very long production run.
This video has been made possible by our supporters on Patreon, our YouTube members and our super thanks donors. Please join them if you can and support the Tank Museum. And thanks for watching.
The M4 Sherman was an American-built tank that first saw action in October 1942 with the British Army at the Battle of El Alamein during the Western Desert Campaign. The tank had arrived at the right time. The British victory represented a turning point in the whole war.
As well as battlefield attrition, the older British tank designs were beginning to be outclassed and outgunned by the improved Panzer IIIs and IVs fielded by the Afrika Corps.
The arrival of around 300 Shermans in September filled a major gap in the British arsenal, and that allowed it to take the offensive. It was better than what they had, and it was better than the light and medium Italian and German tanks of 1942.
By this time, the German army is starting to improve its tanks, like this Panzer IV. Bigger guns, thicker armour. So even by the time of El Alamein, some of the Sherman's flaws are starting to become apparent. One is a lack of hitting power when it comes to the heavier German armour, and the other is a tendency to burst into flames when hit. And this earns it the sobriquet, well, from the Germans they called it the Tommy cooker. Allied troops referred to it as the Zippo, after the cigarette lighter.
But it was reliable, easy to maintain and relatively quick. And now it's available in large numbers. It's not untrue to say this is precisely what led to its widespread adoption by the British, Commonwealth, US and even Soviet forces. Wars are won as much in the factory as on the battlefield. We should remember the USA had very little experience of tank design or production, yet effectively became the arsenal of the free world within just a couple of years. Nothing is a better symbol of this incredible industrial mobilisation than the Sherman tank. Following the Dunkirk evacuation, it was always going to be a difficult task for British industry to meet the requirements of warships, planes and tanks on its own. So the government began buying from the USA. This was initially paid for in gold, but in March 1941, at a time when British money was running out, and despite the objections of isolationists, as the USA had yet to enter the war, President Roosevelt's Lend-Lease scheme was introduced. Lend-Lease would benefit all the Allied nations. It meant equipment could be supplied at no cost, with the idea that only anything that wasn't destroyed or returned after the war would have to be paid for, albeit at a massive discount.
It was only, in fact, in 2006 the British government finished paying for vehicles like the one I'm standing in front of. This is an M4A1 Sherman, and it's named Michael, after Michael Dewar. He was the British industrialist who negotiated the support that resulted in the Lend-Lease Act. It's actually the oldest surviving Sherman, and we think is second off the production line in March 1942.
Michael was considered such an important symbol of transatlantic cooperation that when it was shipped to the UK, it was displayed in public on Horse Guards Parade before being put to work in army trials.
Looking at Michael, you can see some of the distinctive characteristics of the Sherman tank. Looking at the Sherman, it's actually really quite tall compared to a lot of British tank designs of the time. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the M4A1 is powered by the Wright R975 radial engine. That is an engine designed to power aircraft. They put it in the Ford tri-motor. And that's quite tall. So that actually makes the tank tall to start with. But the other thing is it's rear-engined, but the transmission is at the front. And what that means is the drive shaft has to pass all the way down the tank under the turret cage. And that is what results in the sort of humped shape of the thing. The gun you can see here is the 75mm M3, but we know from photographs that the tank was originally fitted with the shorter barreled M2. That's because, like so many features of these early Sherman tanks, it was taken from this, the M3 Lee Grant, and that was very much the father of the Sherman.
The Grant was a stopgap tank, which was again first used by the British in May 1942 in North Africa. It was a stopgap because the US designers and their British customers were very keen to see a 75mm gun mounted in a medium tank. The 75 was a very good weapon for delivering HE in an infantry support role, and without going into depth on US tank doctrine, this was what was intended to be the tank's primary purpose.
The problem was that when the design process began in mid-1940, US industry didn't have the capability to produce a turret capable of mounting this gun. Now, the solution was to put in a sponson on the side, but of course there's a problem with that. It limits the traverse to 15 degrees right and left. The other problem is the height, and this is obviously exacerbated by the fact that we've got another turret on top for a 37mm gun, and in the back is a very tall radial engine.
The Sherman would inherit other features from the Grant, including the tracks, the vertical volute spring suspension, the transmission, and many other parts.
The Sherman was effectively designed as a carrier for the 75mm M3 gun. And in fact, that is the gun fitted the majority of Shermans. But was it any good? The M61 75mm APC round had a muzzle velocity of 619 metres a second, and that would penetrate up to 60 millimetres of rolled homogeneous armour at 1,000 metres. Now, for that early to mid-war period, that is pretty good performance.
But as the enemy began to introduce heavier tanks with thicker armour from the end of 1942, it became much less effective. The prevailing view of the US Army's General Staff at the time was the main job of a medium tank was to support infantry by delivering HE. And for this, the M3 gun was very good. This partly explains why so little appears to have been done to improve the Sherman's firepower, though this would be tackled eventually.
To fight tanks, US Army doctrine dictated the use of tank destroyers like this M10, and these begin to appear from 1943. This is actually based on a modified Sherman chassis, and this really goes to show the versatility of the basic Sherman platform.
The Sherman tank had many variants, named M4, M4A1, M4A2, and so on. These variants all had different engines, required because Shermans were being manufactured in such large numbers and in so many different factories across the USA between 1942 and 1945. But these variants don't represent a linear evolution of the Sherman tank, and it wouldn't be true to say that an M4A2 was better than an M4A1. However, there were upgrades applied to all the different variants, including new guns, new suspension, and new tracks. And that means that M4A2 from 1945 was better than M4A2 from 1942. It's also important to remember that these changes were only applied to new tanks, and older tanks weren't rebuilt. If it survived, an early Sherman could well be in combat at the end of the war. The M4A2 featured the diesel General Motors 6046 engine, and the M4A3 would feature a petrol Ford V8 called the GAA. The M4A4 was slightly lengthened in order to fit the Chrysler A57 multi-bank petrol engine.
The reason that a range of different engines was used in the Sherman is really nothing more complicated than industrial logistics. There weren't enough of any one type available. They were all good power units, reliable, produce between 400 and 500 brake horsepower. As to which is the best, there is one school of thought that suggests that might be the Ford V8 as fitted to the M4 A3.
It's certainly true the US held on to the M4 A3 for their own use, with the majority of Shermans supplied for Lend-Lease, being the M4 A2 and A4.
The M4 A1 is visually quite distinctive because it's got a one-piece cast hull. That gives you this rounded, quite organic shape. The M4 A2, A3, A4, they are of welded construction. Cast hulls had one advantage in that they eliminate the need for welded or riveted joints, and those are, if you like, built-in weak spots. The problem with them is that they are technically difficult to produce, and they required facilities a lot of US tank factories didn't have.
Welded hulls required skilled welders and took longer to assemble, but apparently performed slightly better at shot stopping than the cast hulls. The frontal armour is 50.8mm, that's 2 inches, thick, and on early models it's sloped at 56 degrees, giving an effective thickness of 90.8mm against a round hitting it horizontally. And that really isn't too bad in the early to mid-war period.
But the armour here in the sponson area is just 38mm, 1.5 inches thick. And it's vertical, it's not sloped. The reason the Shermans were prone to brew up when hit is nothing to do with petrol, fuel, anything like that. It's to do with the fact that the ammunition is stored here in the area just above the tracks. To try and remedy the weakness and beef up the armour protection a little bit, applique armour patches were added, as you can see on this M4 A4. Not everyone was convinced they did any good. Lieutenant Steele Brownlee, the 2nd Fife and Forfar Yeomanry, said of his experiences in Normandy,
"The armour was thin. The ammunition was stowed in open bins that exploded if there was any penetration. A hit almost inevitably meant a brew up. Some boffin hitting the idea of welding bits of armour to protect the bins, but their only effect, so far as we could see, was to provide an aiming mark. I certainly saw many brewed up Shermans with a neat hole in the extra armour."
This problem was only remedied with a major redesign that began to roll out in 1944. Now, this introduced wet stowage, with the rounds stored lower down and in liquid-filled containers, and that decreased the risk of an explosion if you were hit. The stowage system is said to have reduced the chances of a penetrated Sherman catching fire from 60 to 80% to just 10 to 15%. Although, of course, there were plenty of older, dry stowage Shermans right around to the end of the war.
more applique was also added in front of the driver and the co-driver's hoods. Now, from late 1943, the Sherman's hull is redesigned to make it easier to manufacture. And the glacis, the thickness is increased to 63.5 millimetres. But the slope is now 47 degrees. So actually no overall gain there. So how vulnerable was the Sherman?
It's fair to say that the Sherman was never designed to resist the Tiger's 88mm gun, which one German source suggests was able to penetrate the glacis armour at 800 metres, and any other part of the tank armour at up to 2 kilometres, and that is way out of the standard Sherman's range. But it's also vulnerable to the armoured vehicles it was most likely to encounter, the Panzer IV, and tank destroyers such as the Stug 3 and Marder 2, armed with the 7.5cm KWK-40 gun. In archive photography, we can also see how crews attempted to improve their protection later on in the war, with field modifications which included sandbags, tank track, and even concrete. Perhaps an acknowledgement that the Sherman could be better protected came in the form of the M4 A3E2, the Sherman Jumbo, which pretty much doubled the armour all over. These arrived in Europe towards the end of 1944 and proved a success, although they were designed for a specific purpose, and the extra armour considerably reduced the speed and manoeuvrability of the tank. So it was a trade-off.
It's one thing for a tank to get hit, but it also needs to be able to hit back. Now, the standard
M3 75mm gun wasn't designed as an anti-armour weapon. And this is more a problem as 1943 unfolds. There are two solutions to this, one British, one American. The British solution was a piece of inspired improvisation. The Firefly was a standard Sherman, but up-gunned with the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. Now that is a much bigger weapon than the M375, so there were some modifications needed for the tank itself. The back of the turret, they had to weld on a bustle to take the radio equipment, and at the front, they had to lose the bow gunner, and his position is welded up, closed off, and that's to create storage for the much larger ammunition that the gun takes.
Around 2,100 Shermans were converted to Fireflies, most being deployed as one per troop of 4, alongside 3 regular 75mm gun-armed Shermans.
This was all done in a massive hurry to be ready for the Normandy invasion. Trooper Joe Eakins, of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, recalled that he'd only fired 5 practice rounds on a range before being sent to France. Lack of practice didn't seem to do Joe much harm, though. In his first engagement near Caen, he knocked out 3 Tiger 1s in 12 minutes with 5 rounds, and then rounded things off with a brace of Panzer IVs. Joe did pull off an incredible feat of gunnery, but he was assisted by an excellent weapon. An APDS round fired from the 17-pounder gun has a muzzle velocity of 1,203 metres a second, and that will penetrate up to 230 millimetres of armour at 1,000 metres. Even the APCBC round would penetrate 150 millimetres of armour at that distance, and that's twice as much as the 75mm gun, and it was more accurate at longer ranges. The American solution was better planned, but it took time to arrive. From mid-1944, factories were fitting a new 76mm gun, and this solved the problem of undergunning.
These Shermans first saw service in July 1944, when the need for increased firepower was becoming abundantly clear to US commanders on the ground in Normandy. The 76mm M1A2 gun could penetrate 88mm of rolled homogeneous armour sloped at 30 degrees at 1,000 yards, using the M62 APCBC round. That had a muzzle velocity of 792 metres a second. This rose to 134mm using the HVAP M93 round, with its higher muzzle velocity of 1,036 metres a second, although these were very rare.
The US Army got around the problems the British had had with the Firefly by fitting the gun in a new and larger turret. They also rearranged the ammunition stowage, and they incorporated the wet stowage that we looked at earlier, and that increased survivability in case the tank was hit. It also enabled them to keep the bow machine gunner. The 76mm gun didn't have as effective a high explosive round as its predecessor, the 75, but it did go quite a long way towards levelling the playing field against enemy armour. And of course, there were still lots of 75mm armed Shermans around right up to the end of the war. So, what can we say about the Sherman? Well, I suppose the first thing to realise is that there's no perfect combination of armour, firepower, mobility. Compromises have to be made. Secondly, when there is a need for mass industrial production, especially in wartime, this is going to lead to further compromises. Sherman was a well-built, reliable tank that arrived in numbers when it was most desperately needed. It was relatively inexpensive. It was, well, for a tank, it was quite easy to maintain, and there were some sophisticated features, things like the stabilised gun. And also, and this is quite remarkable, relatively effective comms kit. It's often criticised for its tank versus tank performance, but that's not really what it was originally designed to do. even though it found itself in that position quite often. But the fact remains, it could still hold its own against the majority of enemy armour.
It was upgunned, and better ammunition stowage improved its survivability. However, except for the specialist jumbo, its armour didn't change, and this left the tank increasingly vulnerable against heavier German guns.
With all this in mind, I think it has to be recognised that Sherman is not just one of the most important tanks of World War II, but one of the most important tanks in the history of armoured warfare. I do hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please subscribe. And if you can, please support us on Patreon.